How you want it, honey?
Rare.
In 1981, Joe Dante's popular werewolf film, The Howling, was released to the public. I've talked about that movie already before in the past and even called it what I consider to be the scariest werewolf movie ever made. A lot of you seem to agree with me, but there were obviously other films like An American Werewolf in London and Dog Soldiers being thrown into that conversation as well. Don't worry, we'll get to them eventually, but for now, I wanted to talk about the sequel to the original Howling that we unfortunately never got to see. So, at the end of Joe Dante's original film, we get one last joke with Marcia being revealed to have lived despite everyone else from Drago dying. Now, while I'm sure most of you guys just thought that was a clever little way to end a horror film, you may not have known that an entire story surrounding the survival of Marcia and her revenge on what happened in the events of the first Howling was actually turned into a sequel. You may not know this because the sequel we got in theaters to the first movie had nothing to do with that story and instead opted to explore Christopher Lee hunting down werewolves in Planet of the Apes looking masks. My friend Tony from Hack the Movies got to talk to Joe Bob Briggs about this and the other Howling sequels for the incredible human accomplishments that they are.
But 3 is about the marsupials, and I have a video on this channel that is like unironically my favorite werewolf movie. It's just so weird and unique.
You are so weird.
1985 saw the release of Howling II, which brought back Karen from the first movie despite having been killed at the end of that film. No mention of Marcia is ever made, and the movie pretty much does something completely different from what you'd expect. Karen's not even the main character, but if you read Gary Brandner's novel for Howling II, you might be surprised when watching that movie because it has nothing to do with the source material at all. Instead, Howling II the book has Karen going on with her life after her husband's alleged death, even remarrying and leaving the experiences from the first story behind with a form of PTSD. There's just one problem. Her husband didn't die, and he's been living with Marcia ever since that fateful night, slowly plotting revenge for what happened in the past. Now, what makes this story so interesting is the fact that it not only follows up on where the original story left off, but it also continues on with the characters from that original plot. And it does so in a way that I actually found to be really interesting because you see in the books, you don't really get werewolves the same way you do in the movies. In the first novel, the transformation into a wolf is actually into a four-legged beast that is described kind of like many other horror wolves we've gotten before in the past. And nobody really stands on two legs or looks the way they do in that first Howling movie. However, Marcia actually does turn into something of a mutant wolf monster because at the end of the first novel, she's actually shot with a silver bullet through the eye. And because she survived, she turns into this hideous, uncontrollable monster that I think would have made for a really cool movie villain. Now, the basic premise is that Marcia and Karen's husband have been living under the protection of superstitious gypsies who pretty much do whatever the werewolves want them to in fear of getting killed if they don't. They spend early sections of the novel hunting down Karen and following her around everywhere trying to make her life a living hell. Of course, this eventually leads to a big showdown where Karen and everyone else have to have a sort of final battle, complete with those mystical gypsies that I mentioned earlier. And while this certainly isn't the greatest story ever made, I do think it would have made for one hell of a decent follow-up to the first movie, especially with that fun little reveal at the end of the original film.
If you believe.
Now, I know some of you may be thinking that they could never have done that movie because Karen dies at the end of the 1981 film, but man, that's not really much of an excuse once you see the version of Howling 2 they actually made and released, which shows her rising from the dead in a coffin anyways, so it's not like they couldn't have brought her back for this story if they wanted to. Really nothing like the novel. Man, you just can't make this shit up. The Howling 2, the actual sequel to the first story, is more of a tense thriller that details the inevitable run-in Karen is going to have with her ex-husband and Marcia. And things get super personal once her ex learns that his old friend, the guy that helped shoot up those werewolves in Drago with silver bullets, is the one that's had a newfound relationship with Karen. The story is filled with scenes where the werewolves taunt their prey by psychologically messing with their minds, running up on unsuspecting people around them, and tearing them apart just to get under the woman's skin. And the whole thing has got this superstitious flair once the gypsies start to play a bigger role in the larger Howling lore. After rewatching the 1981 Joe Dante film, I went back and read through both The Howling and Howling II just before I started to laugh my ass off halfway through a rewatch of the second Howling movie, and I personally think that if you guys are interested, you should definitely check out these books when you get the chance, because a sequel to The Howling, a movie I consider to be one of the greatest werewolf movies ever made, is probably best enjoyed as a serious follow-up with the same cast and events that started in the previous film. The fourth movie, Howling IV, the original Nightmare, actually adapts the book a little more faithfully than the 1981 film, but it's nowhere near as good and features some really bad ADR, to tell you the truth. And by the way, if this old sequel is of any interest to you, the book, you may also want to check out Howling III, Echoes, which apparently does not follow the first two novels, however does adapt the bipedal lichen style werewolf look from the films. I own that too, but haven't got around to reading it yet. Anyways guys, these are all just my own thoughts on the Howling II, the real Howling II that we never got to see, and for some reason even the original book's author didn't want us to watch because he didn't want it adapted into the sequel. I have no idea why, but hey, what do you guys think about the story? Have you read The Howling II? What do you think about that Christopher Lee movie, and what are your thoughts on all of this stuff in the franchise in general? Personally, I think this could have been better than much of what we got, but it just never really happened, which I find to be extremely weird. But hey, whatever your own thoughts and opinions on this book happen to be, and the sequel that was released, I'd love to hear them in the comments down below.